I never imagined that the truth would arrive so quietly. There was no dramatic phone call, no stranger knocking at the door, no obvious sign that my marriage was already cracking beneath the surface. It began with a feeling, subtle, nagging, and impossible to ignore. Small changes in her behavior slowly piled up. Late nights that came with rushed explanations, a phone that never left her hand, sudden emotional distance that made our home feel unfamiliar. I told myself I was overthinking, that marriage naturally goes through phases. Trust, after all, is easy when you choose not to look too closely. The discovery itself was accidental, which somehow made it worse. One ordinary evening, her phone buzzed while she was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious enough yet for that. The screen lit up with a message preview. Intimate, casual, unmistakably romantic. In that moment, the world narrowed to a single point. My chest tightened, my hands trembled, and 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind at once. Denial came first. Surely there was another explanation. Surely I had misunderstood. But once doubt enters your mind, it demands answers. I looked further, each message confirming what I was desperately hoping wasn't true. There was history there. Weeks, maybe months of conversations filled with affection, secrecy, and plans that didn't include me. The woman I trusted, the person I had built my life around, had been living a parallel reality behind my back. The betrayal wasn't just sexual or emotional, it was total. Every shared memory suddenly felt compromised, every promise weakened by deception. What hurt most wasn't only the affair itself, but the realization of how easily I had been replaced. I questioned everything. Was our marriage ever real? Had she checked out long before I noticed? The sense of humiliation was overwhelming. I felt foolish for trusting so completely, for believing loyalty was mutual simply because I offered it freely. The man staring back at me in the mirror that night looked smaller, unsure, stripped of certainty. Confronting her felt inevitable, yet terrifying. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, imagining apologies, explanations, maybe even remorse. Deep down, I hoped she would break down, admit her mistake, and somehow restore the version of reality I had lost. But before words were even exchanged, something fundamental had already changed. The discovery marked the end of innocence, not just in the marriage, but in how I viewed love and trust. That moment wasn't loud or explosive, but it was irreversible. It was the instant my life split into two parts, before I knew and after I knew. The affair wasn't just a secret revealed, it was the spark that ignited a chain of events no one could stop. What began as a hidden betrayal would soon spiral into something far darker. But at that point, all I knew was this: nothing would ever be the same again. When I finally confronted her, I expected chaos, but not what actually followed. The conversation began tensely, voices low and controlled, both of us pretending we could still manage the situation like adults. I told her I knew about the affair, that I had seen the messages, that there was no point in lying anymore. For a brief moment, she said nothing. Her face went blank, as if she were calculating which version of herself to present next. Then she denied it, calmly at first, insisting I had misunderstood everything. But as I pushed back with details she couldn't explain away, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The denial cracked, replaced with anger. Her tone sharpened, her words became defensive, and the distance between us felt charged with something dangerous. This was no longer a conversation about betrayal or broken trust. It was about control. She accused me of invading her privacy, of trying to ruin her life, of being the real problem in our marriage. Each accusation felt like another attempt to flip reality upside down. The argument escalated faster than I could process. What started as raised voices turned into shouting, and then something far colder settled in. Her eyes hardened, and the anger gave way to something that made my stomach drop. She stepped closer and spoke quietly, deliberately, as if every word was meant to cut deeper than the last.
That was when she said it. Clear, direct, and unmistakable. If I didn't stay quiet, if I didn't let this go, she would kill me. The words hung in the air, heavier than any scream. For a moment I couldn't even respond. My mind struggled to accept what I had just heard. This wasn't a threat made in the heat of passion, something blurted out and immediately regretted. There was no panic in her voice, no hesitation. It felt calculated, like a warning rather than an outburst. In that instant, the woman I thought I knew disappeared, replaced by someone capable of crossing a line I never believed she would.
Fear took over where shock left off. I became acutely aware of how alone I was, how vulnerable the situation had become. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about survival. Every instinct told me to de-escalate, to say whatever was necessary to get out of the room safely. I nodded, backed away, and ended the confrontation without resolution, knowing that pushing further could provoke something irreversible. Later, when I replayed the moment in my head, the threat echoed louder than the argument itself. Betrayal hurts, but betrayal combined with violence changes everything. Trust doesn't just break, it shatters into something unrecognizable. The marriage was no longer a source of pain alone. It had become a potential crime scene in my own mind. That confrontation marked a terrifying turning point. The affair revealed deception, but the threat revealed intent. It was the moment I understood that staying silent might feel safer in the short term, but it could cost me my life in the long run. What had once been a personal betrayal had crossed into something far more serious, setting the stage for consequences neither of us could escape. After that night, fear became a constant presence in my life, quiet but suffocating. I didn't sleep much. When I did, every sound pulled me awake, my heart racing as if danger were already at the door. I began to measure my words, my movements, even my expressions, afraid that the wrong reaction could trigger another confrontation. Living in the same house felt like sharing space with a stranger whose limits I no longer understood. The home that once felt familiar now felt hostile, unpredictable. I told no one at first. Shame wrapped itself around me just as tightly as fear did. How could I explain that my own wife had threatened to kill me? I worried people wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they would laugh it off as an exaggerated marital fight. Men aren't often seen as victims in situations like this, and that thought kept me silent. I convinced myself that staying quiet was safer, that avoiding conflict would keep things from escalating. Silence felt like protection, even as it slowly consumed me. Every interaction became a calculation. If she was in a good mood, I stayed neutral. If she seemed irritated, I made myself scarce. I avoided eye contact, avoided arguments, avoided anything that could be interpreted as defiance. I lived in a state of constant alertness, reading her tone, her posture, her breathing, as if my safety depended on it, because it did. The emotional pressure was relentless. I wasn't just afraid of her, I was afraid of what she might do if she felt exposed. The isolation was crushing. I stopped seeing friends, stopped sharing parts of my life that might invite questions. On the outside, everything looked normal, but inside I was unraveling. The fear didn't come in dramatic waves. It settled into me slowly, becoming part of my daily routine. I questioned my own judgment, wondering if I was overreacting, if I had misunderstood her words. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered her eyes, her voice, the certainty behind the threat. Eventually, survival instinct began to overpower fear. I realized that staying silent didn't mean staying safe. It meant staying trapped. If something happened to me, there would be no explanation, no warning, no record of what I had endured. That thought was more terrifying than speaking up. I started to document things quietly, saving messages, writing down dates, times, and the exact words she used when her tone shifted from anger to menace. I saved voicemails. I photographed damaged items after heated arguments. Each step felt surreal, like preparing for a storm I never thought would come, but the act of documenting gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks.
Reaching out for help was the hardest part. Admitting what was happening meant exposing my vulnerability, risking disbelief. When I finally spoke to a lawyer, my voice shook, but the response was calm and practical. The law, I learned, doesn't weigh pride or stereotypes, it weighs evidence. Hearing that changed everything. For the first time since the threat, I felt seen, not as a husband in a messy marriage, but as a person facing a credible danger. Guided by legal advice, I took steps to create distance. I arranged to stay elsewhere temporarily, framed as work-related to avoid escalation. I informed a trusted friend of the situation, giving them copies of key documents just in case. I contacted local authorities to ask about protective options, careful to follow procedure rather than provoke another confrontation. Each action was deliberate, measured, and focused on safety. When the evidence was finally presented, the tone of the situation shifted immediately. The threats that had once felt intangible were now concrete, recorded, undeniable. What she had said in private could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration or marital drama. The system moved slowly, but it moved. Orders were issued, boundaries set, and for the first time there were consequences beyond our living room walls. Watching accountability take shape was both relieving and heartbreaking. I never wanted our lives to end up here, dissected by legal language and timelines. But justice doesn't ask what we wish had happened, it responds to what did. The process stripped away denial and replaced it with facts. It reframed the narrative from a bad argument to a criminal threat. That moment marked a reclaiming of power, not over her, but over my own life. The fear didn't vanish overnight, but it loosened its grip as protection replaced isolation. I learned that evidence is a voice when fear silences you, and the law can be a shield when words fail. What began as betrayal had escalated into danger, but the decision to act carefully, lawfully, decisively turned survival into a path forward. When the case finally reached its conclusion, the reality of everything that had happened settled in with a weight I hadn't anticipated. Sitting in the courtroom, listening to events from my life reduced to evidence and legal language felt surreal. The threats once whispered behind closed doors were now spoken aloud in a place where they carried consequences. The judge's words were measured and firm, outlining how lines had been crossed and why the law could not ignore them. When the sentence was announced, it wasn't triumph I felt, it was finality. Knowing she was facing years in prison brought a complicated mix of relief and grief. Relief because the danger was no longer hovering over me, because there were boundaries now that could not be violated without immediate consequence. Grief because this was never the ending I imagined for my marriage or my life. I wasn't celebrating her punishment, I was acknowledging the cost of choices made long before that courtroom day. Freedom didn't arrive all at once. Even after justice was served, fear lingered like a shadow, slow to fade. Healing proved to be quieter and more difficult than surviving. I had to relearn what peace felt like, how to sleep through the night, how to answer my phone without anxiety, how to trust my own judgment again. Therapy helped, as did the support of people who finally knew the truth. Speaking openly about what I endured was painful, but it dismantled the shame that had kept me silent for so long. The experience forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about relationships and power. Love does not excuse threats. Marriage does not justify fear. Betrayal alone can wound deeply, but when it's paired with violence or intimidation, it becomes something society must take seriously. I learned that accountability isn't about revenge, it's about protection, protecting yourself and preventing harm from spreading further. Looking back, the most important lesson wasn't about the law or punishment, but about listening to warning signs. I had ignored my instincts for too long, believing endurance was strength. Real strength, I discovered, is choosing safety over silence, truth over appearances. It's recognizing that staying quiet to keep the peace can sometimes be the most dangerous choice of all. My life after the case is simpler, quieter, and more honest. Trust is something I rebuild slowly now, with boundaries that are clear and non-negotiable. I no longer confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. The scars remain, but they no longer define me.
They remind me of what I survived and what I will never tolerate again. If there's one thing this story proves, it's that actions carry consequences no matter who commits them. Betrayal may begin in secrecy, but violence ends in exposure. Justice may take time, but it arrives when fear meets the truth. And sometimes the hardest endings are the ones that make survival possible.